Welcome to Fashion, Really, the podcast for people who love fashion but who hate what it does to life on our planet, and who also love a bit of a goss, like I do, on what's been going on in fashion, culture, and how it's impacting all of us who live here, people, animals, and the planet itself. Love from your favourite charity, Collective Fashion Justice. I'm Emma, and this is Joshua. Joshua, how are you?
Hi, Emma. I'm doing well. It's Climate Week in New York City, which
Busy.
Seems to be everybody coming in from all over the world to have 20,000 meetings in various parts of the city. So I've been doing a lot of running around.
Productive or just a lot of air miles?
Yeah. Uptown, downtown, east side, west side, all to talk about climate and solutions. It's actually been great. Really good conversations are being had, and it would be nice if there was like a more centralized kind of like Climate Week campus, though.
Love. Well, let's start by getting really serious. Tell me everything about your outfit.
All right, let's get really, really serious right now. My outfit today is I'm wearing a archival Brave Gentleman bamboo suit, and it's a bamboo lyocell.
What's a lyocell? Explain super quickly for people.
Traditionally, materials like viscose and lyocell and tencel, these are cellulosic fibers, and
Yes.
they're traditionally made from trees, which we like to avoid chopping trees down. And so there are certain on-purpose crops that are better to use than forests for things like this outfit. And ideally we'd be using all waste stream stuff like recycled clothing or or the waste of agriculture industries. But bamboo is better than forests, and not quite as good as waste stream. But this is from several years ago, before I knew very much about materials like this.
And also, you designed it, love. And also, lyocell better than rayon, which are like similar types of materials, right? But lyocell is a cleaner process, less chemical waste.
Yes, there's different processes for making these kinds of materials. Some include a lot of heavy-duty chemicals to soften the wood pulp, and others use things like enzymes and pressure to make it better.
Love that. And what else is going on in this look?
I've got just a nice blue shirt that I found at a thrift store. I'm wearing some Brave Gentleman shoes, some organic cotton socks, and I won't tell you about my undergarments because that's private.
I love the specificity of the organic cotton socks, though, and I feel like it is a win to have socks in like little bits that are better made, so I totally respect specifying.
Yeah. What are you wearing?
Thank you. Thanks for asking. I was going to tell you anyway.
No, but we need to know. So what are you wearing?
My jumper, which is an Australian word for sweater, I guess. But it's a knit, and I designed it, and we have a short film called Willow and Claude, and it follows the making of like Total Ethics knitwear from the farm all the way through. And this is one of those. And it was originally like a nice raw undyed white cotton, but I'm not someone who can wear that because I spill things. So I got it over dyed black. And so this suits my lifestyle much better.
We have that in common. I always wear my food, and it's one way to have a conversation about what you're eating, but
transparency. Exactly. And then I'm wearing vintage necklaces and rings from different little bits and places. I'm also wearing tencel, a lyocell material. This one is a little silky looking skirt, and I'm wearing the same loafers that I talked about last time, which I wanted to point out because we love outfit repeating.
Yeah.
This is more just shoe repeating, but we love it either way.
I'm sure we'll both wear similar things across many episodes repeated, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, in fact, it's good. What else is good is the news. Joshua, it was New York Fashion Week very recently.
It was.
What's been going on over there? Report to us.
New York Fashion Week is always a to-do, and New York being one of the fashion capitals of the world. So things that happen at New York Fashion Week are taken seriously. And one thing that I went to was an event at the Stella McCartney store. It was a PETA event. They were celebrating Stella McCartney's commitment to not having used leather or fur or feathers for quite a long time. And it was a play on the phrase, "It's about fucking time." And you can buy that shirt that she now has on sale in celebration of this. It's about fucking time.
To save the animals, right? That's like the full slogan. Yeah.
Yeah, it's about fucking time to save animals. I believe this was something that was said to her by her father when she had originally finally won her first fashion award.
Interesting. So it was like, do something with this, use your influence for good kind of vibe.
I think, yeah, it was that. And it was a personal memory of hers of when she was a younger designer and having gotten recognized in a major way. And the first time, and her father said, it's about fucking time you got recognized. So that, I think that became a theme of, when something big happens and when something, a big accomplishment, which I think we would both agree that it is about fucking time to save animals. And I apologize for dropping the F-bomb so many times, but I have to, because that's what the slogan is. So
I plan to drop the F-bomb soon as well for my news piece. Can I tell you about one of mine?
Yeah.
Just to keep the swearing going.
Yeah,
I'm Australian, so I'm not apologizing for it at all. I wanted to first talk about the pop girlies in relationship to fast fashion, Chapel Roan, Charli XCX. So in Rolling Stone this last month, Chapel Roan ended up going all over the place. This line went everywhere else as well, because she said, fuck H&M, and that she's saying no to every fucking brand deal right now, and that she doesn't want to do partnerships that aren't aligned with like the world that she wants to build, basically. She also called herself the pop star of Goodwill and the thrift store pop star, which I love.
That's great.
And I thought that was really refreshing and interesting, especially because in that same month, another pop gal that I also love went a different way. Charli XCX opened London Fashion Week with like DJing at a party, I think, that was hosted by H&M. So two very different takes on H&M. And it just made me think, I find it disappointing, particularly when it's someone who I like their artistry, goes down this kind of line of helping to sell and promote fast fashion when in reality they're definitely not wearing fast fashion. They're wearing like interesting designers and luxury stuff. I was thinking about it. I feel like pop stars think that being a part of fast fashion makes them seem like of the people because it's accessible or something. But I actually think that it's like, you're selling stuff that is poor quality to people, and you're also not of the people because you're definitely not of the people who made those clothes and who were exploited, and it's not for the people who are going to be like harmed by the waste that's caused by that. Yeah. And that's obviously a bit of a bummer to talk about, but I think it is really important that we hold these people that have like a lot of power to a higher standard. So I thought Chapel Roan, on the flip side, that's nice to just say that at the very least. That
disconnect between the reality of the lifestyle that the celebrity's living and then how those garments are made. And I have a really serious question that is associated with that. And is that disconnect brat?
I was ready to be so serious. I had no idea what you were going to say. It's not brat. It's not demure. I can never hear someone say the word demure again. I think it's been ruined for a lifetime, but no. It's not.
So Charli, if you're listening, it's not really brat to
promote fast fashion and destroying our finite planet.
Yeah, come on.
Synthetic clothes.
We need you promoting sustainable fashion, Charli.
Yeah,
so
we'll hook you up with someone.
Get in touch.
Okay. What's your next piece of news?
In addition to the Stella McCartney news, I also attended a fashion runway show for the well-known American designer Christian Siriano, who famously is a winner of one of the earlier seasons of Project Runway. So Christian is a celebrity favorite, does a lot of red carpet stuff, a lot of Hollywood stuff, beautiful gowns. One of the innovation partners that I work with through Canopy, Cirque, they unveiled a really exciting piece of fashion history on the New York Fashion Week runway, which is, it's a material that's made from all waste diverted cotton poly blends. And it's a beautiful silky fabric, probably not unlike what you're wearing as your skirt. And it was the first time that a poly cotton blend, recycled lyocell fabric, was put on a New York Fashion Week runway. And these were really gorgeous, flowy, beautiful, chic, sexy, cool looks. And it's just great to see something like that be elevated by a designer like Christian, and for it to be taken seriously and put in a light that these kinds of innovations are aspirational, and they can be beautiful, if not more beautiful than the conventional fabric. And I think that when we talk about good design and when we talk about what is beautiful, we can't just talk about that final product, the end product that we see. We have to talk also about the production process. Is that also beautiful? Can we call something that's made in a horribly ugly way beautiful just because it looks nice at the end? I don't think so. What do you think?
I also don't think so. You might be surprised to know. I think that's also really interesting what you said about like making these materials aspirational, because they should be. And like you're saying, they're more beautiful the whole way through that making process. But I was reading some data recently about how people perceive, and I've heard brands that we like consult with say this as well, that when people see materials that are promoted as like more sustainable, particularly that are recycled, it comes with this perception that like, oh, they're of a lower quality, but it just doesn't need to be true. And you can make incredibly stunning things from these kinds of materials. Interesting.
Do you have any other news items?
I do have another news item. It's about London Fashion Week. We obviously have to just keep talking about fashion weeks, given this is a wrap up of September. And we at Collective Fashion Justice, we did some research. We looked at every member brand for the British Fashion Council, and what we found ended up in a lot of the news. The Independent, The Guardian, Fashion United, Drapers, even my little head on Channel 4. And it found that only 3.4% of all of those brands had any emissions reduction target, and even fewer had one that was actually science-based, so aligned with meeting the Paris Agreement, which without doing so, our world falls apart. So that's a less good, that's a boo news. And made a splash because it's like, we would think that in 2024 we were ahead of this, right? And the British Fashion Council does do some really good work to help their brands, but it's like, if this is the outcome, it's clearly not happening fast enough.
Yeah, and right in line with that, some other news that I looked at was almost a quarter of the largest fashion brands and businesses are not sharing any information about their decarbonization efforts.
And this is a really good point too. This was for public targets, because if it's not public, you can't be held to account on it. It has to be public.
Yeah, according to the news that I read, at the top of who's doing good as far as reporting, there's about 13 brands, with Puma, Gucci being some of the better brands that are reporting.
For at least having the targets, not necessarily even like meeting them. Yeah.
Just sharing data about decarbonization, just being able to talk, just being able to have information available about efforts for decarbonization. And then the brands that aren't even bothering to talk about it at all or have any information available are companies like Aeropostale and BCBG, Max Azria, DKNY, Forever 21, Nine West, Reebok, Saks, Tom Ford.
Which I think is good to show as well that it's across the spectrum from fast fashion to luxury fashion, because there's such a notion that like the fast fashion brands we know are doing a lot of things that are just like so terribly destructive. But there's this assumption that, oh, if it's luxury, it's inherently slow, it's inherently ethical and sustainable. And unfortunately, that's just like not the case. But it could be. The roots of that kind of fashion are much more aligned with where we need to be, but we've strayed far from that.
Yes.
Should we talk about books?
Yeah.
You go first. Please.
Well, I just want to preface my commentary about what I read with saying I could have flown a private jet to all of the best libraries of the world to read many different books. And because I didn't do that, I have saved so many emissions.
You could have flown to Australia just to speak to me and then fly right back.
Yeah, and flown back. And I didn't do that. And I deserve a pat on the back. And I deserve recognition for not causing those emissions. And that would explain what Scope 4 emissions reporting could turn into. So I read about Scope 4 emissions reporting, which is, it's kind of a joke because...
Explain the scopes, I think. We have to start even further back. We're talking about emissions associated with a business, or for what we're talking about, like a fashion brand, right?
So Scope 1 is what the company actually owns and controls.
Yes.
So you own a factory, those are your Scope 1 emissions. But if you're paying for utilities for that factory, then those utilities are Scope 2. Scope 2 are what would be considered indirect greenhouse gas emissions. And those occur when, a business or an entity purchases, let's say, utilities, electricity, heating, cooling. Those would be Scope 2. And they're a result of usually energy use.
And then Scope 3 is going further back into the supply chain. So like raw materials. If we're talking about leather or we're talking about cotton, another material, there's emissions associated with producing those that have nothing to do with anything you own, but that you still profit from. They're part of your value chain, which is like a supply chain, but linked to what value do you extract from those processes. Scope 3 is one that the fashion industry for ages was like, oh, no, that's not really our problem. But it very much is, because like 38% of emissions associated with fashion come from raw materials. So Scope 3 is a big one.
Right. And when companies get to sidestep reporting Scope 3, materials, especially animal materials like wool and leather, they can appear to be much more low impact than they actually are, because often what's being reported is not
different allocation methods.
Right. It's not the raising of the animals, the feeding of the animals, the grazing, the methane, all of that stuff gets ignored. And then Scope 3 comes along, which is a more recent thing that companies are being required to report Scope 3, and they suddenly have to report on the entire life cycle, all of the activities, even activities that they don't own, and that they don't control, but maybe it's part of their supply chain.
Which is like when brands have gone, oh, we only count the emissions from our leather after the slaughterhouse and from the tannery, even though there's all these emissions associated with the farm. Or like, oh, we only count the emissions from our polyester, which is made from fossil fuels, from the factory where they're like making that material, even though that means cutting out mining from the supply chain, which are like two pretty huge things to just cut out.
That's why Scope 4 is a greenwashing minefield, because it just opens up the door to create all sorts of hypothetical scenarios of what could have been and what wasn't. And it enables companies to say, well, we could have purchased this type of material or done this XYZ thing. And because we didn't, we get to report emission savings for not doing something that we may have otherwise done.
And just making out like that balances out. They're very real and very high emissions.
Right. I see that, Scope 4 could come into play realistically if somebody has actually transitioned away from doing something that they used to do, and then they can now say, we actually used to do this thing and we don't anymore. But I don't see how that's not counted in other scopes. Scope 4 is a strange thing
that we need to watch out for.
Yeah. Scope 4 is not part of the greenhouse gas protocol. It is something that kind of came up and it's going to be abused as a marketing tool, I think.
Interesting. And on that note, I want to move into reading a little bit of the book that I read, which is The Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion by Tansy E. Hoskins. I actually read part of this to research my book, Total Ethics Fashion, and I referenced it, but I didn't read it like a book, like front to back. I read the specific part that I was interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And then I went back and was like, I'll read it properly. So I'm just going to read a little bit. And it says that corporate power is ideologically bolstered by the romantic idea that the famous fashion designer is a godlike figure capable of summoning their ideas out of thin air. And it talks about critiquing this idea as like hyper-individualistic and omitting the artist as a worker and a part of a particular part of history using particular materials, and ignoring the fact that like this is kind of an oversimplification of artistic work. And it uses this example where it says, all the materials and skills that produced great works are socially produced, just as even the greatest pianist needs a socially produced piano to perform on, not made of ivory. The most lauded designers need socially produced, and then they say like pencils, the things that they were taught, all of the materials, the farmers behind it. And I just really liked this idea of acknowledging that and saying designers are incredible, but there's so many incredible people in fashion that we kind of overlook. Like we don't think about the people sewing our clothes as artists, but they have incredible skill. Yeah. And I think if we kind of brought all of those people back into the public eye and celebrated this kind of communal way of creating, you wouldn't be able to continue exploiting those people so much because they wouldn't be hidden, and it would make fashion something that everyone like participates in a more democratic way, and in a way that I think makes you appreciate things more. Like working on the film for this knitwear that I was talking about, it made me actually cry a few times. I love a good cry. Like being on the farm and being like, I'm literally touching cotton that is attached to the plant that's grown from the soil. And now I know like that I stood in that field and now I'm wearing it. It makes it so much more special, I think.
Wow.
So that was what I read.
Where did you find out about that, the book?
I think I was looking for the section in my book, Total Ethics Fashion, that's about like degrowth and looking at future fashion systems that are not linked to this like infinite growth version of capitalism. I was just like looking at, does stuff about that exist? And so the title of this book, The Anti-Capitalist Book of Fashion, was obviously like pretty high up on the search results for that.
Also, getting back to that idea that we were talking about earlier, where making the process, also making it beautiful and celebrating the process in addition to celebrating what the final object looks like, and taking away this sort of celebration of one individual designer when so many people and so many things go into making a garment. Yeah, and I love what you said about making it impossible to exploit people through highlighting them and making them visible in supply chains. And that will put, I think, an emphasis on the reality that there's a reason why supply chains get hidden. There's a reason why fashion is so much about fantasy and not about the actual process itself. Because often the process is shameful. Often the process is something that we want to hide under layers of fantasy. And when we unveil it and see it for what it isn't a beautiful thing often.
And there's so much like mystique and beauty in the creation of clothes that are ethical and sustainable.
Yeah.
Like holistic farming of plants and people doing amazing things with their hands. Like it's all really interesting and beautiful if we just showed it to people. And then the things that are not so beautiful would pretty rapidly leave because it wouldn't be good for marketing.
Yeah. When I used to teach at Parsons, I would often ask my students, what do you think a fashion system that wasn't about profit would look like? How could you envision clothing and garments and accessories that existed for purposes other than just making profits? And it really gets the creative wheels turning, but it also asks some I think it inherently points out some important questions about how things are made, who's making them, where they're made, of whom they're made when they're made from animals' bodies.
So our main topic, I want to talk about that now, is material certifications. What are they? Can we trust them? What's the deal? I think first we should talk about what some of the most common ones are that people might have heard of. Joshua, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's some really common certifications out there that you might have heard of, like fair trade. That's one big one. And what fair trade means and the logo associated with it, these aren't necessarily the same things.
Like fair trade is a literal certification, but it's also just like a term, and people can very easily confuse the two.
Yeah, and when a term matches a logo or a slogan of a certification, it can create some confusion, and people may assume that that the certification is better than it actually is, or that the term means something different. There's also the organic standard. There's the global organic textile standard versus other organic claims. Sometimes you might pick up a garment and it might just say organic cotton without having like a GOTS, which is the global organic textile standard.
GOTS. Which that one is good, right? Like GOTS has a lot of benefits for the farmers. It's not just about like not having synthetic chemicals. There's a social component as well, land considerations. The actual fair trade certification, I think, is quite good in that sense as well. But then there's this issue of like fair is a really big word. Does it mean fair only to people? Does it also mean to animals? Does it mean to the planet? The fair trade certification does literally mean only to people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is fairness? How do we define fairness? And is it limited to just humans, just workers? I would hope that would be a more expansive term, but there's a narrow definition that has to apply for certifications. Which
is very similar to like the Better Cotton Initiative, which is something that a lot of people might have seen, BCI. Again, better, it's such a like loose word.
Better than
people would assume
what?
Better than like modern slavery, better than what? It doesn't necessarily mean good. And BCI cotton has been linked to modern slavery, including in Xinjiang in China, which the fashion industry has attempted to ban cotton coming from there, but it's so difficult because no one shares anything about where anything is from.
Yeah, there's a lot of loopholes also that are coming up when it comes to things that are being imported. There's something called the de minimis loophole that the current administration in the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, is trying to address, where clothing that's coming from especially a lot of these fast fashion brands that get to exploit the de minimis loophole, they can send things from anywhere and it won't be inspected and it won't be looked at all.
What is this word you're saying? Go back. De minimis.
De minimis. It means basically that there's a minimum quantity that is a threshold before the customs and border agencies and the trade agencies will inspect something. And so if you order one shirt off of a fast fashion website from overseas, that would fall under the de minimis threshold, and it would be a loophole. Whereas if they sent a boatload of clothing that was several tons, then that could get turned around and rejected because of the origin of that cotton coming from a region that's considered labor exploitation or modern slavery.
It's high risk. Yeah. Interesting. I think recycled is also a really big one that people see a lot in terms of certification. So I have a little question that someone has asked. Let's ask it.
I feel like recycled labels in fashion can be kind of deceptive sometimes. How do I know if it's actually recycled or not? And can you recommend any particular certifications that I can trust?
I feel like this is very true, particularly for a few reasons. The first, there's so many garments that are called recycled when like 5% of the actual material is recycled. So that's problem number one.
Mm-hmm.
And then just as there's more organic cotton sold than there actually is organic cotton produced, which means there's mislabeling, there's so many things that are mislabeled as recycled. The Global Recycling Standard, GRS, is probably considered like the most legitimate, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. You'll see it on the label as GRS, and that will be the certification typically.
With little arrows in a circle.
You'll see the triangle.
I have another question though. Let's hear it. This is from Sam.
What is the deal with all these responsible standards? So like responsible wool, responsible down, and do they actually help people?
People, animals, planet is the rest of that question. The responsible standards, they're from Textile Exchange. What are our thoughts, Joshua?
Yeah, those are industry ethics washing labels that I think are unfortunately misleading a lot of consumers.
So responsible wool standard and down standard, they inevitably do like somewhat reduce the suffering of the animals in those supply chains, but just like better doesn't mean that much. Reduce also doesn't mean that much. For example, the responsible wool standard, if there's no pain relief available, then you can just cut off the tails and testicles of sheep without any pain relief. It also doesn't do anything about the fact that the sheep are slaughtered. It doesn't address the methane emissions at all or how land inefficient wool is. And for the down standard, it's similar. Those ducks are killed at like 6 weeks old, and it's a factory farming system. So they're not plucked alive of their feathers, but like, are we really calling factory farming and slaughtering birds when we have an alternative responsible? I would rather use flower down made from wildflowers or recycled materials, personally.
Yeah. And these are often certifications that are self-enforced, right? They're not certifications that are being certified by external third parties that are neutral.
Or if they are, it's so infrequent. And there's opportunity for like cleaning up the process beforehand to show like the shiniest, best version of it, which I think leads to saying that like certifications, you really need to be very clear about the specific thing that they do. Don't just read the word responsible or better or fair and assume that that means it's good. Understand specifically what it means. So like the responsible wool standard means that live lamb cutting or mulesing, which is a particularly horrific practice, doesn't happen. So that's what you should know about that standard. There are other things you should know about it, but you should also know all of the ways that it is limited. Because if you don't know the limitations of something, you don't know like if you actually think it's useful to you and your purchasing.
There's one other certification that I think people might come across, and that would be FSC certification. That's the Forest Stewardship Council certified.
Trees.
And when it comes to materials that are coming from trees and from forests, it's recommended that when we can't source materials from waste streams like textile waste or agricultural waste, if there has to be virgin inputs,
like at that point, they should at least not be the oldest, most precious trees. They should be farmed.
If there has to be virgin fiber going into these materials, then they should be FSC certified. So Forest Stewardship Council is an important certification when it comes to forest products, like as we were discussing, those viscose cellulosic fibers.
Okay. The last section of Fashion Really today that we're going to do every time, because I think it's fun, is the greenwash or ethics wash, which is a lesser known version of greenwashing and deception, more about how people and animals are treated. Greenwash of the month. Go first, Joshua. What have you seen? Let's celebrate failures and ask for better.
So there is a problem inside the Italian luxury industry, and that problem is sweatshops, which isn't necessarily often associated with luxury fashion, right? It's often associated with what would be considered cheap, fast fashion. But there was a probe into the Italian luxury industry that called out certain brands like Dior and Armani for labor exploitation. And this is in supply chains that are including, dozens of brands. There were practices that are being considered sweatshop practices. And maybe if listeners aren't familiar with what defines a sweatshop, it's conditions for garment industry workers, fashion industry workers, or it really could be for any industry. But in this case, we're talking about garment industry. They could be working on accessories or clothing. And those conditions are exploitative, could be considered, in some cases, modern slavery. They could be dangerous, putting the workers' health and lives at risk. They could be working them for far too many hours. They could be paying them what would be considered wages that don't meet living standards.
It's not like an easy label to get. You have to be really exploiting people for something to be considered at sweatshop level, which is a huge deal for an industry that talks so much, ethics washing, about craft and quality making, and that have videos of people wearing white gloves while they make things in a beautiful, nicely lit studio. Yeah. And then it's not that.
The juxtaposition of this concept that luxury fashion puts out there of the impeccably handmade, the considerate way of making everything so carefully and so conscientiously and so intentionally. And then to find out that, okay, so if you're making everything intentionally and you're intentionally using sweatshop labor, what does that say? And that is a real form of both ethics washing, greenwashing, and it should be illegal.
Yeah. And it often is, and it's still happening anyway. Yes. Big sigh moment. That's a good ethics washing of the month. That one is such an example also of how these industry initiatives to improve themselves aren't enough without external pressure and government pressure to be this is not acceptable. And if you can't prove that it's really good, and as you say it is, it should be a problem.
Yeah.
And
What's
you
yours?
shouldn't be able to market that way. Mine is about the Woolmark company.
Oh, we love them.
We love them. It's a company that is designed to promote wool, specifically Australian wool. And they had a new ad, which if you didn't know it was from them and you watched the first 30 seconds of it, you would absolutely love it. It was really good. The creatives behind it were good. And it was all about it's all these clothes without people in them. So ghosts running through a city, tearing it up, causing terror, making everyone scared. And then they basically run off of the end of this highway overpass. And the messaging is about the ghosts of synthetic clothing, because everything we've ever made from fossil fuel materials still exists. And that is terrible. And up until then, I was I'm so sold. This is really important messaging about fast fashion and synthetics. But then the marketing of Woolmark comes in and they say, wear wool, natural, renewable, biodegradable. And that's when I'm fully lost, because number one, it creates this false binary that you're either wearing a fossil fuel material or you're wearing wool, which just forgets that people have worn plant materials for literally millennia. Mm-hmm. And there's so many more now, and there's bio-based innovation and recycled materials. And it also is talking about this really important sustainability issue, but only as a form of greenwashing, in that one of a key form of greenwashing is to distract from real impacts. And that's exactly what this is doing, because wool has a huge methane footprint. We did research, and actually most of the time that wool is used by major brands, it's blended with synthetic materials, or it's coated in a synthetic coating that makes it non-biodegradable.
It's called scouring.
Yeah. Well, scouring is the process. That's chemical heavy. And then there's also the plastic coating.
Oh, right.
So there's
two
different things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then it's just this pretty lady in a nice sweater in a nice environment. But it's this is an environment that is being destroyed often by the wool industry. There's deforestation and devastation for wool in Australia. And also not a single sheep at the end when we're talking about wool,
Yeah.
because the wool industry knows that they can't talk about the ethics of wool because they would fail to make it seem good. So they just eliminate the reality of where wool comes from their marketing. So this is a greenwash of the month for me, because it's like, if the first part came from a charity like ours, I would have loved it. But then they just tacked on this thing at the end that totally like dirties the rest of the messaging.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a pretty classic move for the animal fiber industries to position themselves as the alternative to what is fake and plastic and permanently, harming the environment. It creates this false binary, as you said, and what people don't get to hear, what's left out, is how those industries are incredibly harmful as well.
We can do better than both. It's not an either or. There's so many other great materials.
There are.
That's the end.
Yeah. Thanks everybody for listening. Please visit us at Collective Fashion Justice.
Next time our topic is going to be next gen materials. So literally the solutions that we're talking about now. So that will be fun, and I won't have to sigh so much.
Yeah.
And if you have questions, send us a voice note, because you could be one of the voice note people, and that could be fun for us all. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.